Across the Jim Crow South, the night was often filled with fear. Hooded riders moved through the darkness, their torches glowing like cruel stars. In many towns, the sound of hooves or car engines in the distance meant danger for anyone whose skin was dark. For generations, people were told to stay quiet, to bow their heads, and to survive by enduring. But not everyone accepted that fate. In the heart of the South, some black communities made a different choice. They refused to live as victims beneath the shadow of hate. Instead, they organized. They gathered in church basements and backyards, where whispers turned into plans, and fear began to change shape. They learned to watch the roads, to protect one another, and to stand their ground. These were not people seeking vengeance or violence for its own sake. They were fathers, sons, and neighbors who wanted to live free, to keep their families safe, and to defend their dignity in a land that denied them justice. In a world where law enforcement often looked the other way, and courts offered no protection, they took on the burden themselves. They stood guard outside churches where freedom meetings were held. They rode beside civil rights organizers traveling dangerous roads. They built networks of trust and courage, ready to act if the night riders came again. Some were veterans, men who had worn the uniform of a nation that still refused to treat them as equals. Yet they carried the discipline and resolve of soldiers who knew that freedom was not given, it was defended. From Georgia's coastal towns to the pine forests of Mississippi, from the hills of Tennessee to the small cities of Louisiana, these men and women carved out a new kind of resistance. Their story is one of courage under threat, of communities that dared to fight back when the world expected them to hide. This is the story of those who refused to bow, the story of the black men and women who made the Ku Klux Klan feel fear for a change. Stay with us as we uncover their forgotten courage, the moments that history tried to bury. If you believe these stories deserve to be told, don't forget to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel. Together, we keep the memory alive. It was the summer of 1899 in Darien, Georgia, a quiet coastal town surrounded by swamps and pine forests. Life there followed a harsh rhythm, shaped by segregation and fear. The memory of slavery was still fresh, and though the Civil War had ended decades earlier, its shadow lingered in every courthouse, every field, and every unspoken rule that governed the lives of black residents. One morning, the peace of that small town shattered. News spread like wildfire: a black man named Henry DeLegal had been accused of assaulting a white woman. Within hours, rumors twisted the story into something darker. In those days, such an accusation was often enough to seal a man's fate. Across the South, men like Henry had been dragged from their homes, beaten, and killed, sometimes before a trial could even be spoken of. Everyone in Darien knew what came next. The whispers began to grow louder. A mob was forming. White men from nearby towns were said to be gathering, their anger fueled by talk in the saloons and on the courthouse steps. The sheriff's office did little to calm the situation. Justice, in those moments, was a word without meaning. But Darien was not like every other town. In this community, the black residents had learned through bitter experience that silence and fear would not protect them. Many of them were veterans, men who had worked on the docks, built homes, and served their country in uniform. They had seen enough injustice to know that no one was coming to save them. As the sun went down, a group of local men met quietly under the cover of night. They spoke in low voices, planning their next move. They knew the mob could arrive at any hour. The decision they made was not an easy one, it was born from necessity. They would not allow another lynching to stain their town. When the mob finally came, armed and shouting for blood, they did not find an unguarded prisoner or a frightened community. They found rows of armed black men standing firm. Shotguns and rifles were pointed toward the road. The air was tense, thick with the knowledge that one spark could ignite tragedy. But the mob hesitated. The courage of those men broke the rhythm of terror that had repeated for generations. That night, no lynching took place. Henry DeLegal lived to see a courtroom. And though the outcome of his trial was still shaped by the biases of the time, something had changed in Darien. For the first time, a mob had been turned away, not by the law, but by the determination of people who had decided that enough was enough. Word spread beyond the county. In nearby towns, people talked about what had happened in Darien with a mixture of disbelief and respect. Some saw it as defiance. Others, as justice long overdue. For the black residents, it was a quiet victory, a moment that proved unity and courage could hold back even the fiercest tide of hate. In the years that followed, the men of Darien continued to watch the roads at night, their resolve unbroken. The Ku Klux Klan and other groups still tried to intimidate them, but the fear was never quite the same. The memory of that standoff lingered, a reminder that courage can be contagious, that one act of resistance can echo through generations. Henry DeLegal's story faded from most history books, but in the hearts of those who remembered, it became more than a tale of one man's survival. It became a lesson in dignity, a moment when an entire community stood tall and said, "No more." In the spring of 1946, the small town of Columbia, Tennessee, carried the uneasy calm of a country freshly returned from war. Soldiers were coming home, trains rolled through with the sound of whistles and steel, and people were trying to rebuild their lives after years of sacrifice. But beneath that surface of post-war pride, the old divisions of the South remained. Freedom had been promised on the battlefields of Europe, yet in the American South, equality was still a dream deferred. Among those returning home were black veterans, men who had fought in France, Italy, and the Pacific. They had worn the nation's uniform, faced enemy fire, and carried the flag of a country that had not always carried them. When they came back to Columbia, they expected, at the very least, to be treated with dignity. What they found instead was the same old system of segregation, suspicion, and violence that had long defined their home. The trouble began in February, inside a small store in Columbia's business district. A dispute between a black Navy veteran named James Stevenson and a white shop clerk quickly turned into an altercation. The veteran had defended his mother after she was insulted, and the confrontation left the clerk injured. Word of the incident spread like wildfire, inflamed by gossip and resentment. Soon, the talk in town turned dangerous. A white mob began to gather, shouting for punishment. The echoes of the past were returning fast. But the black community of Columbia was not what it once had been. In the section of town known as Mink Slide, a lively, self-sustaining black neighborhood, people decided they would not allow history to repeat itself. Many of the residents were veterans, men who had fought for freedom overseas and now understood its price. They knew what it meant to organize, to stand together, and to face danger with discipline. As the night fell, the tension broke. Shots were fired. The streets of Columbia erupted into chaos as local police, joined by armed white residents, attempted to invade Mink Slide. But this time, they met resistance. The veterans and local men had taken positions, determined to protect their homes and families. The gunfire lasted through the night, echoing through the hills, shaking a town unaccustomed to seeing black men defend themselves with such resolve. When dawn arrived, the fighting subsided, but the aftermath was brutal. The Tennessee Highway Patrol swept through the neighborhood, arresting dozens of residents, destroying property, and beating those they found. Yet even through the violence and arrests, something irreversible had happened. The people of Mink Slide had stood their ground. They had shown that courage could challenge even the oldest patterns of fear. News of the confrontation spread across the nation. Civil rights leaders and organizations took notice. For many, the Columbia Race Riot, as newspapers called it, marked the beginning of a new era. It was one of the first open acts of armed resistance against racist violence in the post-war South, a signal that returning black veterans would no longer accept life under threat. The courts eventually intervened. Thurgood Marshall, a rising attorney for the NAACP, came to Columbia to defend those arrested. His work there foreshadowed the battles he would later fight in the Supreme Court, and the struggle he helped lead toward justice for all Americans. Though the scars of that night lingered, the spirit of Mink Slide lived on. It was a moment when ordinary citizens, hardened by war and guided by unity, stood for their right to exist without fear. It was not an uprising of hate, but a stand for dignity, a declaration that those who had defended democracy abroad would now demand it at home. In the 1950s, Monroe, North Carolina, was a small southern town like many others, quiet on the surface, divided beneath it. Segregation ruled everything: the schools, the parks, the restaurants, even the sidewalks. But in this town, something unusual was stirring. It began with one man, a veteran and community leader named Robert F. Williams, who refused to let his people live in fear any longer. Williams had returned from serving his country overseas, carrying with him the discipline and resolve of a soldier who had faced tyranny firsthand. He had seen fascism fall in Europe, and he struggled to accept why, back home, his neighbors were still forced to bow under the weight of racism. He joined the local branch of the NAACP, becoming its president, but in Monroe, advocating for justice was not just unpopular, it was dangerous. The Ku Klux Klan was active and unashamed. They rode openly through the streets in motorcades, waving their symbols of intimidation, their car horns blaring like sirens of hatred. They burned crosses near homes, threatened families, and made sure everyone understood who held power. For years, the pattern had been the same: the Klan would appear, and the town's black residents would lock their doors, praying the night would pass quietly. But Robert F. Williams decided that would end. He understood that words alone could not stop men who carried guns and torches. So he did something that few could have imagined at the time: he organized. Under his leadership, a group of veterans and working men came together to form what became known as the Black Armed Guard. It was a lawful organization, recognized through an official National Rifle Association charter. Their mission was simple: to defend their community from unlawful violence. They trained with care, respecting the responsibility that came with carrying arms. They built watch posts, patrolled their neighborhoods, and made sure the Klan knew that intimidation would no longer go unanswered. Their approach was not driven by anger, but by necessity. They did not seek confrontation, but they would not run from it either. One night, the Klan drove through Monroe in a long, roaring line of cars, headlights cutting through the dark. Their goal was the same as always: to frighten, to remind everyone of their presence. But as they turned down one familiar road, they were met with something new. Members of the Black Armed Guard stood quietly along the roadside, visible and ready. When the Klan realized that the people they had once terrorized were no longer defenseless, their motorcade hesitated. The intimidation failed. The Klan turned back. That moment rippled far beyond Monroe. For the first time in living memory, a black community in the Deep South had successfully stood its ground against organized terror. The news spread through the movement, through activists, churches, and student groups. Some debated the idea of armed defense, others saw in it a new kind of courage. But to the people of Monroe, it meant one simple truth: they no longer had to be afraid. Robert F. Williams became both respected and controversial. His belief was not that violence could solve injustice, but that self-respect required the means to protect one's life and dignity. "A man cannot beg for freedom," he once said. "He must stand for it." In the years that followed, Williams' ideas influenced a new generation of thinkers and activists who saw self-defense not as opposition to peace, but as a condition for it. His story became a quiet chapter in the long struggle for equality, a reminder that courage sometimes wears the uniform of discipline, that dignity can stand guard at the gates of fear, and that even in the darkest times, organized resistance can bring light. In the Deep South of the 1960s, the road to freedom was lined with danger. Civil rights workers traveled from town to town, knocking on doors, organizing meetings, and registering voters. Their courage was remarkable, but so was the violence they faced. Night after night, gunshots rang out near meeting halls. Cars carrying activists were run off rural roads. Homes of local leaders were burned to the ground. The law, when it was present at all, often stood on the wrong side of justice. In places like Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, the message from those in power was clear: resistance would be punished. But out of that fear came a different kind of determination. Among the ranks of the South's black citizens were men who had worn the uniform of the United States military, veterans who had served in World War II and Korea. They had fought tyranny abroad and returned home to find it alive in their own country. These men knew tactics, discipline, and how to organize. And they refused to let their brothers and sisters be slaughtered in the name of order. In 1964, in the small town of Jonesboro, Louisiana, a group of these veterans came together to form what they called the Deacons for Defense and Justice. It began quietly, without fanfare or public speeches. They met in church basements and private homes, swearing an oath to defend their communities and the civil rights workers who risked everything for change. Their weapons were legally owned, their purpose lawful, but their presence changed everything. The Deacons began patrolling neighborhoods at night, escorting freedom workers through dangerous areas, and standing watch during voter registration drives. Their visibility alone often stopped violence before it started. When night riders tried to intimidate activists, they found themselves facing armed, disciplined men who refused to back down. The message was unmistakable: the age of helplessness was ending. In Bogalusa, Louisiana, a small industrial town known for its tense racial atmosphere, the Deacons grew in strength and resolve. When the Ku Klux Klan planned demonstrations, the Deacons appeared nearby, calmly maintaining their positions. There were no shootouts, no chaos, just the quiet power of men who would no longer allow harm to come to their people. In one instance, their intervention prevented an attack on a civil rights march that could have ended in tragedy. Their courage spread beyond Louisiana. In Mississippi and Alabama, other groups began to organize under the same name, adopting the same discipline structure. They trained, they coordinated, and they built networks of protection around marches and meetings. Civil rights leaders, including Martin Luther King Jr., were aware of their presence. Some in the movement worried that armed defense could harm the message of nonviolence, but even they understood a deeper truth: without the Deacons, many nonviolent protests might not have survived long enough to make history. Their influence reached Washington. As news spread of armed black veterans protecting civil rights workers, federal officials could no longer ignore the danger activists faced. Pressure mounted on the government to step in and enforce constitutional rights in the South. The presence of the Deacons forced a reluctant federal response: troops, marshals, and legal protections that finally began to curb some of the worst acts of terror. By the late 1960s, the Deacons for Defense and Justice had become a symbol of strength and discipline. They proved that self-defense and moral courage could coexist, that dignity was worth guarding, and that peace sometimes requires the readiness to stand firm. Though their names rarely appeared in the headlines, their impact rippled across the movement. Each march that reached its destination safely, each home that survived the night, carried their silent signature. They were the unseen guardians of freedom, men who stood between terror and hope, ensuring that the promise of justice could live to see another dawn. In the heart of Mississippi during the 1960s, the struggle for equality was not fought only in the streets of big cities or the halls of government. It was waged on dusty backroads, in small towns, and on farmland that stretched beneath wide southern skies. It was there, among cotton fields and wooden churches, that men like Cock Chin took a stand. Cock Chin was not a politician or a famous activist. He was a farmer, a landowner, and a respected figure in his rural community. His strength came not from wealth or power, but from a deep sense of responsibility. In those years, Mississippi was one of the most dangerous places in America for anyone involved in the fight for civil rights. Efforts to register black voters were met with threats, intimidation, and violence. The Ku Klux Klan operated freely, their presence a constant reminder that progress could cost a person everything. Cock Chin knew the risks, but he also knew the importance of standing firm. He had worked his land for years and built a small measure of independence in a time when most black farmers were trapped by debt and discrimination. That independence gave him something rare in the Deep South: freedom to act without fear of losing his livelihood. He decided to use that freedom to protect others. Each night, as darkness fell and the familiar hum of insects filled the air, Cock Chin would patrol his property. A rifle rested in his hands, not as a symbol of aggression, but of vigilance. From his porch, he could see the flicker of headlights on the distant road, the faint sound of engines that sometimes carried danger. The Klan often used the cover of night to strike fear into families who dared to stand for change. But in Kok Chin's part of the county, their visits grew less frequent. They knew this was not a place where they could ride unchallenged. By day, Kok Chin worked closely with local activists who were organizing voter registration drives. He offered his land for meetings, his barn for safe shelter, and his reputation to shield those who came under threat. He used his influence to calm tensions, to mediate between frightened neighbors and bold young organizers who came from the cities. In a world divided by fear, he became a bridge, a man whose quiet strength gave others the courage to act. There were nights when the danger came close. Rumors spread of Klan caravans moving through nearby towns, of cross burnings just a few miles away. But whenever they neared Kok Chin's land, the riders hesitated. They knew his name, and they knew he would be waiting. That knowledge alone was enough to change the balance of power. In time, his farm became more than a home. It became a symbol of protection, a safe point on a dangerous map where activists could rest and regroup. For many who came through Mississippi during those years, his hospitality meant survival. His vigilance allowed voter registration efforts to continue in places where others had been driven out by fear. Kok Chin never sought recognition. His story rarely appeared in newspapers, and few outside his community knew what he had done. Yet his quiet watchfulness made a difference. It showed that courage did not always shout or march, it could also stand silently on a porch, keeping the night at bay. When the struggle for voting rights finally broke through the walls of resistance, it was because of countless men and women like him, people who refused to surrender their dignity or their land, who understood that true freedom requires not only hope, but the will to defend it. In the story of America's long road toward justice, Kok Chin's name may be a footnote, but his spirit stands tall, watching over the fields he once protected and the future he helped to make possible. The story of the civil rights movement is often told as one of peaceful marches, songs of unity, and the moral strength of nonviolence. And while that is true, it is not the whole story. Behind the images of protesters sitting calmly at lunch counters and marching with linked arms, there was another layer of courage, one that carried the weight of protection. For every preacher who preached peace, there was a farmer who stood guard. For every marcher who faced a mob unarmed, there was a veteran watching from the shadows, ready to ensure they made it home alive. In the Deep South, nonviolence could only flourish because someone was willing to defend those who practiced it. When organizers traveled through hostile territory, when meetings were held in churches surrounded by darkness, and when buses carried young volunteers through backroads known for danger, the presence of quiet protectors made all the difference. They were the guardians of the movement, ordinary men and women who refused to let fear dictate their fate. This balance between nonviolent action and armed defense created a unique kind of strength. The public face of the struggle, the marches, the speeches, the sit-ins, projected moral power to the world. But the unseen hands that guarded those moments ensured they could happen at all. In places like Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana, the idea of pure nonviolence often met the harsh reality of unchecked violence. Local communities adapted not to contradict the message of peace, but to preserve it. Activists like Martin Luther King Jr. and others who led the national movement knew that courage came in many forms. Even as they preached love and forgiveness, they understood that not everyone could afford to remain defenseless. In many towns, after mass meetings ended and the cameras disappeared, watchmen took their places outside. They stood under the stars, listening for footsteps, guarding families who had become targets for simply seeking equality. These acts of defense did not diminish the message of nonviolence, they sustained it. They allowed the movement to endure in places where violence could have crushed it overnight. Every home that remained safe, every organizer who survived to continue the work, became proof that dignity could be defended without surrendering principle. The narrative that Black Americans were passive in the face of oppression was shattered by these realities. The communities that rose in defense of their rights showed the world that strength could be both disciplined and restrained, that resistance could take many shapes. Their defiance was not born of hate but of necessity. It was the refusal to accept that survival must depend on submission. In small towns and rural counties, the lessons of self-defense spread quietly. Families passed them down in whispers, in the way fathers taught sons to stay vigilant, in the way mothers hid their fear behind calm faces. It was not about seeking conflict, it was about ensuring that terror would not have the final word. As history moved forward, and the great legislative victories of the 1960s became law, the stories of those who defended the movement often faded into the background. But their legacy endured. The marches that captured the world's attention, the speeches that reshaped a nation's conscience, all were made possible by people who understood that peace required protection. In the end, the power of the civil rights movement came from its harmony between courage and care, between moral conviction and human instinct. The men and women who stood ready in silence gave depth to the dream. They reminded America that freedom is not granted by those in power, it is secured by those brave enough to defend it, even when the world is watching only the ones who walk unarmed. For generations, fear had ruled the nights of the South. It crept through the woods and down lonely roads, carried by men who hid their faces and claimed power through terror. Their message was simple: obey, stay silent, and survive. But fear, no matter how deeply it takes root, depends on silence to grow. The moment people stand together, the moment they decide they will no longer bow their heads, the power of fear begins to crumble. Across small towns and backroads, from Georgia to Mississippi, that quiet rebellion took shape. It wasn't marked by speeches or banners, but by the steady resolve of those who refused to surrender their dignity. These were farmers and factory workers, fathers and veterans, young men barely home from war. They did not fight for glory or revenge. They fought so their children could walk through their towns without looking over their shoulders, so that justice would no longer be something whispered but something lived. Their courage was not loud, it was steady. It lived in the watchful eyes that guarded a neighbor's home, in the hands that gripped a tool by day and a rifle by night, in the calm determination to protect one another when the world looked away. They understood something simple but powerful: when a community stands united, even the darkest threats lose their strength. Their actions did more than defend lives, they reshaped the spirit of resistance. By standing firm, they showed that dignity could not be taken, only surrendered. Each night they stood guard, each day they refused to retreat, they reclaimed a measure of freedom that no law or decree could give. They proved that courage does not require permission, and that unity, when forged through shared purpose, can be stronger than any weapon. In time, their example rippled beyond their towns. It reminded the nation that the path to justice is not only paved by those who speak, but also by those who stand watch in silence. The history of their bravery may not fill the pages of textbooks, but it lives on in the freedom they helped preserve. Their defiance was not just against violence, it was against the idea that fear could ever define a people. Terror loses its power when confronted by courage. And these men, with their unity and discipline, proved that organized self-defense was not the opposite of peace, it was the protection of it. Their story is a reminder that strength and honor can rise even in the harshest times, that dignity is not given but reclaimed through action. If stories like this inspire you to see history in a new light, remember to like this video, share it with others who value truth, and subscribe to our channel. Together, we keep these forgotten chapters alive, one story at a time.